Well, surprisingly, I find myself mostly in agreement with what I've heard to this point. Like Ghaith, I'm a former, not a current. But unlike the two previous speakers, it is interesting that this is the topic of this session was the region and the Israeli elections. And what we basically have heard so far is what's going on in Israel, what's possible with Israel as it relates to the Palestinians, and what's possible from a Palestinian perspective as it relates to the Israelis. So let me actually also deal with the topic, which is not a criticism, it's just an observation, and say the following. Point one, what is striking about this Israeli election, and it kind of picks up on, I think, Dan's point that was implicit in what he says, and I'll make it more explicit. This is an election, and you wouldn't know that Iran as a existential threat is something that is so prominent that it ought to be part of the discussion within the election, because it's not. The Arab awakening, which is being played out in the region with enormous uncertainties, this is too not something that's being debated within the Israeli election. What's going on next door in Syria, which is one manifestation of the Arab awakening, but also an indication of how badly it can go, is not part of the discussion and debate within the Israeli election. And when it comes to the Palestinians, I think suffice it to say, there is a kind of, with the possible exception of Tzipi Livni, you wouldn't really know that there is anything to be done. So you have a region that is boiling, and you have an election campaign that's taking place as if somehow this region that's boiling is there, but let's talk about other things. Now, oftentimes, in my teaching, especially as I talk about the region, I will talk about paradoxes. Well, this is certainly an interesting paradox. Now, the explanation, I think, relates to the fact that, in many ways, I think what Dan was describing, the paradox of Israel today is that the country, in truth, is mostly a centrist country, and the politics are not reflecting the centrism, they're reflecting the kind of polarization on the two sides. And then the competition becomes a competition within the two sides, not between the two sides. And so that's what we're seeing in the election. So there isn't really a connection between the election and what's happening in the region. Let me offer a few observations, and I may conclude, depending on how, whether Moran sort of makes me stop, which is always a possibility. I may conclude with a kind of a variation on what you were suggesting at the end, Ghaith. But let's just take, if you take a step back and you look at Iran, we're going to have a new Israeli government that will probably, my guess is, it will be a government that will emerge by the middle or the end of February. It'll be a government where the current prime minister remains the prime minister. It'll be a government where he will want to position himself in the center, meaning that he'll have, his own party is to his right now, but he'll have a coalition that is both to the right and to his left. And by the way, that's in his interest because it will give him greater room for maneuver. Now, that new government's then going to have to deal with the following sets of issues. One is Iran. Now, the temperature on Iran within Israel has been reduced, basically since the Prime Minister's speech in New York. I expect that as diplomacy resumes, and it will, sometime later this month, I expect that the 5+1, these are the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, plus Germany, will resume talks with the Iranians. And if those talks look like they're a repetition of the past, if they look like they're going to drag on, if they look like there's no early conclusion in sight, then the temperature from Israel will go up again on this issue. And so it'll become more prominent. And the question that will be joined will be, does Israel feel that it's running out of time again? Now, when the Prime Minister gave his speech at the UN, he focused on something that was not actually what had been the focal point for some time. For a long time, you heard the the defense minister, Ehud Barak, talk about what he called the zone of immunity. And what he meant by the zone of immunity was there's going to come a point where the development, redundancy, and sheer breadth and depth of the Iranian nuclear program was such that Israel would actually lose its military option. And no Israeli prime minister is going to accept a situation where you face an existential threat and you lose your military option. So Israel would have to, if diplomacy didn't produce anything, Israel would have to act on its own prior to that point. Now, the prime minister's speech in New York wasn't about the zone of immunity. It was about a red line. It was about what's the point at which Iran acquires the ability to present the world with a fait accompli when it comes to a nuclear weapons capability, and the world can't do anything about it. That's very different from the zone of immunity. The zone of immunity was completely unrelated to the state of how quickly, or the status of the program and how quickly the Iranians could produce a nuclear weapons capability, because it was a function of an infrastructure that acquired the kind of capability where Israel, in fact, would no longer have a military option. So that we'll have to see whether this issue of the zone of immunity comes back. Because ironically, from an Iranian standpoint, if you use the red line that Prime Minister Netanyahu identified, which was a bomb's worth of medium-enriched uranium, the Iranians have all sorts of options where they can just decide to go slow and push that off. By the way, they did some of that already because they took some of the 19.75% that they had enriched to, they oxidized it and turned it into fuel assemblies for a medical research reactor, which ironically, again, paradoxes, one of my themes, the US built for Iran in the mid-1960s. So if they decide to simply do more of that, then the red line that the Prime Minister identified isn't hit. But the infrastructure is continuing to be developed, in which case the question of when Israel loses its military option will come back into the fore. My expectation is that issue will become prominent again. And it will become prominent again in the spring. And so I do expect that the U.S.-Israeli dialogue on this issue will remain extremely important. There is a very high-level dialogue between the administration, between the two governments, and it's conducted at both the political and the technical level. I expect that to be the case, but I also expect that we're likely to see in the spring the temperature rise again, because if nothing has happened diplomatically, at least in terms of changing Iran's behavior, then the issue comes back. Now, maybe it will. Maybe we will see something happen prior to June when the Iranians themselves have an election. But that's an issue that is worth watching for as you think about the Israeli government that emerges and what are the issues it's going to have to contend with. That's certainly number one. Number two, Egypt. Egypt is, it is, I used to joke in the past when I'd be asked about the Arab Street, and I'd say, you mean what's going on in Egypt? Because that's half the Arab Street. And what we have in Egypt is the emergence of a Muslim Brotherhood-dominated government, a Muslim Brotherhood that has an unmistakably clear ideology. It is highly organized as a group. It is extremely disciplined in terms of who it is. It has a capacity to look long-term in terms of its ideology and its strategies, which means it can adjust based on needs. And I think its current leadership will adjust to ensure that it can deal with the economic issues, but we also saw something very recently that was an unmistakable indicator of who they are. You know, after President Morsi brokered the Gaza Deal, which itself is interesting because, again, it shows between an ideological impulse and an economic imperative, he chose to follow the economic imperative. The easy thing for him to do emotionally, given the base of the Muslim Brotherhood and their ideology, would have been to break with Israel. But if he broke with Israel, then there's no help coming from the outside, not just the US, but from others as well. And they need economic help because the Egyptian economy is basically collapsing. And they need to deliver something as well. So after he brokers the Gaza deal, he not personally, he allows his intelligence people to do it. He still doesn't deal with Israel. He still doesn't even utter the word Israel except as an adjective. Okay? When he uses it's Israeli to modify usually words like aggression. But When it comes to not breaking the treaty, when it comes to maintaining ties, he understands the importance of that. And that, by the way, is extremely important for us, and it's extremely important for Israel, not to be dismissed. We actually have the ability to influence this new Egyptian government. We have and should be working very closely with the Israelis, and this should be a focal point for the new Israeli government to be focused on how can the U.S. use its relationship with Egypt to build increasing contacts between the two, and not limited only to the intelligence vehicles. I'm not suggesting that's not important. It is important. But the one virtue of getting this government more pregnant with the Israelis is because it then becomes, in a sense, a legitimization of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, which for the Muslim Brotherhood, in the years they were out of power, they sought to say this was a treaty between Sadat and the Israelis, Mubarak and the Israelis, but not the Egyptian people in Israel. So focusing on that as an objective becomes, I think, extremely important, both for Israel and for the United States. And Egypt's needs are significant. Just one other point on this before I go on to the next issue. You know, when I said there was a very important indicator, one indicator was the one I mentioned on Gaza, but there was another one. And that was the one thing that President Morsi, after this decree, doing away with judicial oversight, he then was prepared to compromise on that. You know the one thing he wasn't prepared to compromise on? The timing and the date of the referendum. He would give nothing on that, even though this produced a real backlash, even though it convinced the opposition in Egypt that the only thing the Muslim Brotherhood really wants is to dominate everything. He wouldn't give on that. You know, he could have given 2 weeks, but he didn't, because he knew their superior organization. He knew their unmistakable identity. He knew their outreach to the 40% of Egypt that lives on $2 a day or less was such that the referendum would guarantee success. And they would then have a new political floor for legitimacy, political legitimacy. And that he wasn't prepared to give on. So anybody thinks that the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, they don't really believe in their ideology, think again. They do. But they also are prepared to rationalize how they proceed. They understand they may have more immediate needs, and they will be able to succeed over time. They will continue to try to build these floors of political legitimacy. They will continue to try to change the rules of the game to serve their interests. We have to deal with them with our eyes open. We have to deal with them with an understanding we're not going to transform them. They have an identity, but they also have a set of needs, and how we approach them needs to reflect that. Third issue that the new Israeli government is going to deal with, and this one may confront Israel much sooner than anything else, that's Syria. You know, I don't know how soon Hafez al-Assad's son, Bashar al-Assad, will no longer be in power. What I know is at some point he will no longer be in power. I can't tell you if it's 6 weeks, 6 months, or 18 months. I don't expect it to go longer than that, but what will be the result of a longer process is Syria will become increasingly a state that looks less and less like a state and more like different groups of different powers. And the more that becomes the case, the worse it is actually for Israel. Not only Israel, I would say for the region as a whole. But look at every state that is bordered by Syria, every single one of them. Israel is one, Jordan is one, Lebanon is one, Turkey is one, Iraq is one. Every single one of them is going to be affected by a Syria that increasingly has less central authority. And if the sectarian divide, which I'm afraid we're already maybe very close, if not past the threshold on this, if the sectarian divide becomes unbridgeable and you're basically looking at Iraq 2006-2007 as what happens within Syria, who controls the chemical weapons? This is not a trivial concern, not just for us, but obviously it is profoundly important for Israel. And one of the things that we and the Israelis are going to have to focus on with Jordan, with Turkey, it'll be much harder to do anything with Iraq, unfortunately, and the same with Lebanon, is what do you do to build buffers against the potential threats that are going to emerge out of Syria? And particularly with the emergence increasingly of radical Islamists who have been the major beneficiaries of money and material coming from the outside. it's completely understandable that the United States would be very, very cautious in terms of providing arms, because you really have a very hard time knowing who is going to end up having them and who they're going to be used against. And given the history we had in Afghanistan, this is the last thing you want to repeat. Having said that, if you don't get active in terms of providing money and materials, including lethal assistance, your capacity to influence the balance of forces in the opposition is fairly limited. Now, that's not a role for Israel to play, but it certainly is a role for the United States to play, and in consultations with the Turks, the Israelis, and the Jordanians, all of whom have different assets for understanding who's who or who's emerging within Syria, and we have a big stake in that. All right, the Israeli-Palestinian issue. You heard two sets of analyses. The two sets of analyses basically say, look, if you think this is a time to launch a big initiative and resolve the conflict, you're living on a different planet. And it's pretty hard to argue with that. I would actually, first I happen to agree with the analysis. Just because I agree with the analysis doesn't mean I completely agree with the prescriptions. And I guess what I would say is I also have a slightly different explanation, although it's consistent with the analysis of both Dan and Ghaith. For me, the biggest single issue is the loss of belief. This is not confidence and this is not trust. That's trivial. Belief is faith. I'm saying it here at Georgetown in this building. Belief and faith have been lost when it comes to peacemaking on both sides. This is not a case where one has lost it and the other hasn't. This is a case where both have lost it. The reason the polling represents mirror imaging is that on each side, you'll still find the mainstream saying they would accept a two-state outcome. And in fact, the numbers are almost the same on each side. But even when they say they would accept a two-state outcome, they also say it'll never happen. They completely disbelieve that it can happen. And the challenge is, at this point, what do you do to try to reestablish belief? Because if you don't reestablish belief, I'm afraid even as you try to change the realities on the ground, which is also consistent with what I think we ought to do, I'm worried about the future identity of the Palestinians, which I think could become Islamist. And if it becomes Islamist, this is a strategic disaster for Israel. This is not, anyone who thinks that, well, there's no difference between, the Islamists and Fatah. There is, because the Islamists believe this is a religious conflict. And you can't, for them, all of Palestine is part of an Islamic trust. And as part of an Islamic trust, you can't concede 1 inch. Fatah, whether one is satisfied that they're not saying things like 2 states for 2 peoples, they still believe this is a national conflict, not a religious conflict. And so it happens to be in America's interest, it happens to be in Israel's interest, that the future identity of the Palestinians remains a national one and not an Islamist one. So the question to ask is, what can both of us be doing that makes that more likely rather than less likely? And that's point one. Point two is, what can we be doing, and what kind of an effort should we be making, and in consultations with the Israelis on, given what I just said, how do you preserve the Palestinian Authority? One, and two, what do you do to restore belief? Particularly if the belief is about the other sides being completely unwilling or incapable of carrying out a 2-state outcome. Now, I actually do have a 16-point proposal. And I can either give it later or I can do it now.
Let's do it later.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I will do it.
All right.